Welcome everyone to our Integrated Pest Management academic seminar series, which is designed to increase awareness of new research and techniques that advance IPM and its adoption in all types of pest management settings. These seminars are once a month during the academic year, and you can find the upcoming seminars as well as our other events like our What's Bugging You First Friday series on our website, which I'll link to in the chat in a minute. But now it's my great pleasure to introduce Bryony Sands, livestock IPM specialist and former extension assistant professor at the University of Vermont. She's now in Scotland. She works with farmers and conducts applied research to help better understand the impacts of agricultural activities on insect biodiversity, pest and parasite populations, and ecosystem function in livestock grazing systems. Her research integrates entomology, agroecology, and livestock parasitology, and focuses on the impacts of livestock pesticides on functionally important insect decomposer communities, and developing novel environmentally sensitive approaches to pest and parasite control. And before her work in Vermont, Bryony worked at the University of Bristol in the UK, where she also received her bachelor's, master's, and PhD. So thank you, Bryony.
Thank you for that introduction. So I work on livestock integrated pest and parasite management in the grazed pasture ecosystem. So that is looking at sort of sustainable ways that farmers can control pests and parasites, but it also considers beneficial insects and beneficial organisms in the pasture ecosystem. Obviously, most of these organisms, pests, parasites, dung beetles, etc., have their life cycle through the manure on the pasture. And so this is sort of all under the umbrella of dung ecology, as well as pasture insect management. So today I'll give you an introduction into dung ecology, because I know not everyone will be familiar with that concept. And then I'll move on to just talk a little bit about the livestock integrated pest and parasite management work. And for the second half of the talk, I will give you some research updates on the work that we've been doing over the past sort of 5 years in Vermont and New York State, focusing on the dung beetle side of things, impacts of pest and parasite management on dung beetles, and the importance of dung beetles for pasture health. So when I first moved to the US, on one of my first farm visits, a farmer said to me that 90% of farming is about decay, death, and decomposition. I was a little taken aback by that, but I did have to agree. I was at the farm to study dung beetles and their importance in the process of decomposition out on pastures. So one of the most vital decomposition processes occurring in our grazed pasture land is the recycling of large quantities of nutrient-rich livestock manure. That can be in the form of cow pies, as pictured here, or small ruminants, sheep, goats, etc. And this needs to be recycled back into the soil as fertilizer. So it's a very highly valuable resource. And farmers do rely on it for their farm nutrient balance. It contains all of the major plant nutrients, so nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, a whole host of micronutrients, and it's also the main contributor to soil organic matter in the pasture environment. So along with that, it also emits certain gases, so carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide. So it's very important that this resource gets down into the soil as quickly as possible through the process of decomposition, so that all of that good stuff can get recycled into the soil. And so that's where this dung ecosystem comes in. A manure pat is home to a huge biodiversity of organisms. So we have flies and mites, worms, parasitoid wasps, predatory beetles and dung beetles. Then there's fungi and bacteria, and all sorts of other things as well. All of these organisms fulfill different ecological roles. So here we have beneficial invertebrates. So these are the sort of the good bugs. They can have different ecological functions. So they can be decomposers, they can be parasitoids and predators. So again, things like dung beetles, earthworms, predatory beetles. So the decomposers here will be recycling, sort of breaking down that manure and recycling all those nutrients into the soil and contributing to pasture fertility and soil health. And then we have sort of the parasitoids and predators, which are not necessarily processing and eating the manure, but they will live there and they will hunt other insects such as pest fly larvae and sort of kill pests and parasites in the dung. So they have a really important role in suppressing pest and parasite populations on pastures. Manure is obviously also home to the bad bugs, so the pests and parasites. So that includes external pests and parasites like flies, ticks and lice, and then the internal worms and sort of gastrointestinal parasites. And they are also transmitted through dung patties on pastures, and they cause obviously a lot of problems for our livestock. So I just wanted to show you a few examples close up. Some of these species of beneficial predators and parasitoids are really quite beautiful, I think. So here we have species of predatory beetles. We have flies, which have certain life stages which are carnivorous, so they'll eat other insects. And then here we have a parasitoid wasp. So this little wasp is actually laying its egg inside a pest fly pupae. And that means that the wasp larvae will eat the pest fly larvae inside there. And then instead of a fly emerging, it will be a parasitoid wasp. So these organisms, as I mentioned, are really important in suppressing those pest and parasite populations on pastures. Then we have our coprophagous beetles and flies. So coprophagous means that they eat poop, basically. So these organisms will live and breed in dung patties and consume the dung itself. During those processes, they act to decompose it, to fragment it, and break it all up. And here we have a picture of some yellow dung flies, which flies will tend to land on manure within moments of it being deposited. Then we have these little red beetles here. These are dung beetles. And on the right, we can see a load of different dung beetle species there. So black ones, gold ones, and red ones. And you can really already see them shredding up that cow patty. In the middle, this is a soldier fly and the soldier fly larvae. Soldier flies are very efficient decomposers. They can process a large amount of material very quickly. You might have seen those in the news because they're so good and so important for this decomposition process. So I'll just talk in a little bit more detail about dung beetles. They are my favorite of the dung insects. So generally we have three groups of dung beetles. We have dung dwelling beetles, and the fancy name for that is endocoprid. That just means that they live on the surface here. They don't tunnel underground, but they just live in the surface dung, and they will breed and live there. And sort of their role is fragmenting and drying out that patty on the pasture surface. And then we have our tunneling or paracoprage dung beetles. And these are the ones that are making these tunnels underneath the dung patty, and they're dragging the dung down to make their little brood balls in the tunnels there. So you can see that that is really important for physically relocating dung from the surface down underground quite quickly. Then we have the final group, which is the ball rolling or helicopterid beetles. There's a little bit on the side of this image here. You can see they break a bit off, make it into a ball and roll it away to bury it. We don't really find those species in the Northeast, so they are very cool, but I won't really be discussing them in this talk. We mainly find these two groups, so the dung dwellers and the tunnelers. So this process of dung decomposition takes place over sort of days to weeks, depending on the time of year, the weather conditions, and obviously the insect populations in the pasture. You can see here's this image with the yellow dung flies, which land on the very fresh manure. And then this next image, things like beetles will be coming in. You can see there's loads of little holes in that manure, and those holes are made by predatory beetles, and you can see it's just riddled with holes. So that is really effective in drying it out, shredding it, breaking it up, and then finally, the final stages of decomposition, other organisms like earthworms will come in and bring those final fragments down into the soil. So that process can't actually happen without the action of all of these beneficial invertebrates that live in the dung. And studies have shown that dung patties don't actually break down at all without these insect decomposers. And they've done experiments where they've excluded these insects from patties, and they are still on the pasture surface a year later. So weathering alone takes much too long to recycle all this manure. It's not achieving what we need it to in terms of sort of nutrient cycling in the pasture environment. And I just did a little calculation and found that if we didn't have dung insects, the whole of the Northeast would be covered in poop within a year. So that just goes to show how important these insects are. So these beneficial insects are providing a whole host of pasture ecosystem services, from dung decomposition, as we've been talking about, to nutrient cycling, pasture fertility and soil health, also hydrological properties of the soil. So if you think about all those tunnels that the dung beetles are creating, that's going to help water be absorbed into the soil much better. And then pest fly and livestock parasite control, and contributing just to biodiversity in their own right. They are prey items for organisms higher up the trophic level, such as sort of farmland birds and mammals. So it's very important that we think about how we can protect and conserve these organisms in order to keep our pastures sort of functioning properly. So my work on integrated pest and parasite management for livestock is really about balancing the control of those bad bugs, the pests and parasites, with supporting all these good bugs. And that is with the goal to provide the best possible outcomes for the livestock, the farmers, and the environment all at the same time, hopefully. Okay, so now I will move on to talk a little bit about livestock integrated pest and parasite management. So the pasture ecosystem is made up of many interconnected parts, as you can see here. So there's obviously the sunlight, the plants, the soil, and the animals. The animals are not just the livestock, but all of the other insects, birds, wild animals living in that system, as well as the farmers and the humans that are interacting with that too. And that connectivity between all these parts really matters, because it means that what we do to one part of this is going to impact all the other parts. And those processes really we're only just beginning to understand. So sort of the forage that I grow is going to impact the soil and the animals and the atmosphere. And likewise, what I do to the livestock is going to impact all these other parts too. And really the point of that is that we can't try to manage just one of these parts in isolation. We have to consider this whole system when we're thinking about management practices. And that's really what we mean when we talk about taking an integrated approach to pest and parasite management. So pests and parasites are a major livestock health and production challenge, and clinical disease is usually prevented by using various insecticides and anthelmintic or worming chemicals that are very good at controlling these pests and parasites, unless there's resistance, which I'll talk about in a moment. But there are some costs to using these, particularly sort of over relying on them. And firstly, that's the negative environmental impact. So when we treat animals with insecticides and anthelmintics, those chemicals pass through and are excreted in the dung, and they are still insecticidal when they come out in the dung and they're out on the pasture. And we know that up to 90% of that dose can be excreted sort of unmetabolized. So here we have insecticide residues in the dung, and as we've seen, that's going to have toxic impacts on all of those lovely beneficial insects that are living in the dung, as well as the pests and parasites. So other costs are to do with the development of resistance. Obviously, I'm sure you're all familiar with overusing pesticides, and then pest and parasite populations will quickly develop resistance if we're treating sort of whole herds of animals regularly over the whole season. It's really a recipe for resistance and treatment failures. And we see that worldwide, not just across America. Particularly, it's an issue for internal parasites of small ruminants, but we're also seeing it in pest fly populations as well. So that is another very important reason why we need to minimize the use of these treatments and conserve them for when we really do need them. Using them too much also reduces the ability of animals to develop their own natural immunity, because they need to have some level of exposure to pests and parasites in order to become immune later in life. So that's also counterproductive, because then you end up having to treat older animals that would have otherwise had natural immunity. And then finally, there's obviously restrictions for organic producers. They can't use a lot of these treatments anyway. So it's clear that we need alternatives, and that's where IPM comes in. So yeah, here we have a system where these management practices, such as the use of those insecticides, are interacting in feedback loops with soil health, with animal health, pasture health, and biodiversity. And looking at the impacts of the pest and parasite treatments on this system is a good example of how a system like this can be disrupted, because as we mentioned, these treatments that we're using to kill pests and parasites will also be killing our beneficial pasture insects, and that could have knock-on impacts on soil health, on cattle health, and pasture productivity. So finding the best ways to sort of balance all these interacting elements has been the object of my research, and really trying to find out what the management practices are that can optimize all of these outcomes for the best results. Okay, so for the second half of the webinar, I'm just going to present some of the results of our research. that we've been doing over the past sort of 4 to 5 years, really focusing on the dung beetle side of things. So I want to talk a bit about some of the dung beetle surveys that we've been doing first, finding out more about dung beetle species in the Northeast, what species we have here. So that includes the first ever dung beetle survey that was undertaken in Vermont, which I led in 2022. That was shortly after I moved to America. And then shortly after that, I found Ken Wise and Hannah Tolles at Cornell, who were working on really similar things and also really interested in dung beetles. So since then, we've sort of teamed up and joined forces, and we've been doing a lot of work together, looking at dung beetles across New York and Vermont together. So these pictures show some of the methods that we use to trap beetles to do these surveys. The top one here is a pitfall trap. So you can see this cow patty on the wire mesh there, and underneath that is this bucket that's been buried flush with the ground. So we just bury that and we put the dung on top, and the idea is that the beetles will fly in, tunnel through the dung and get trapped in that bucket underneath. And you can see we've been emptying one here, and there's a lovely dung beetle that's been collected in that. So this is the method that we used for the surveys in Vermont. For the subsequent surveys, we've used this dung beetle extractor method. So this is basically a big tote with smaller containers inside, and we put samples of manure in those containers, and you can see the little holes there on the other side. We're collecting jars underneath, so the dung beetles will crawl out of this dung and get collected into the vessel there. So they're sort of the two main techniques we've been using. Looking at the results of the Vermont survey first, we found, well, we worked with 29 grazing dairy farms in Vermont, and we found 700 dung beetles in, 7,000 dung beetles in this survey, plus lots of other dung insects, so those predatory beetles, etc., that I was showing you earlier. And we actually collected 20 different species. So you can see some of the species that we found here. Some of them are really quite impressive. And 11 of those species were native to the US, and 9 of them were introduced species. That is quite a common, well-known occurrence, especially as you get further north in the US. There is quite a large proportion of introduced dung beetle species, mostly of European origin. So it's thought that when the ships sort of came over to America, they brought livestock with them, and inevitably they brought dung beetles with them too. And those dung beetles have thrived in North American pasture environments. So this is actually quite a good ratio. It's about half and half of native and introduced dung beetle species. However, so this is more detail on, these are all the different dung beetle species that we found, whether they were native or not, and then the total numbers of each species. So despite about half of the species being native, when you add up all of the individual dung beetles, only 8% of all of those individuals represented the native species. So most of the individual dung beetles were the introduced species from Europe. And you can see this particular one beetle here, Colobopterus erraticus. There's a picture of it there. There was over 5,000 of those specimens, and that made up about 74% of all of the dung beetle individuals that we collected. So we can see that really these introduced species are starting to dominate the dung beetle communities in the Northeast. So looking at the New York State survey, we worked with beef farms this time, so 26 grazing beef farms in New York, and we found 9,000 beetles this time of 18 different species. There were 7 native species and 11 introduced species from Europe. So again, it's, you know, there's a few less native species there, but it's roughly what we would expect. And we found 5 species that were not found in the Vermont survey. So there's some lovely pictures there taken by Hannah Tolles of those species. So we're up to about 25 species of dung beetle that we've found in these surveys so far. If you are interested to look at all these species in more detail and see what we found and how you can identify them, we have some resources online. There's identification sheets on my UVM webpage. And then Ken Wise and Hannah Tolles have made this really good visual identification guide. That's on the Cornell Cows IPM website. So just head over to there if you want to have a look in more detail at these species. All right, so I'm going to move on now to talk about dung beetles in relation to pest fly management practices. So we wanted to investigate what the impacts of feed-through insecticides for pest fly control in cattle is on beneficial dung insects. These insecticides are designed to pass through the animal, come out in the dung and kill pest fly larvae in the dung. And our hypothesis was that they would also be likely to kill beneficial dung insect larvae in the manure patties as well. So we worked with grazing beef farms in New York, and 10 of those farms used the feed-through insecticides, and 16 did not use any insecticides. And we measured dung beetle abundance and diversity on those farms, and also pest fly populations on the cows. And the technique we used was this dung beetle extractor that I showed you a picture of earlier. So again, the manure is collected and put in the container, and the beetles crawl out and get trapped in the jar underneath. So looking at the results, this is the first year we did it in 2022. These top 2 figures show the beneficial insects. So this is dung beetles and predatory beetles here. And then the bottom 2 figures show pest flies, so horn flies and face flies. The different bars show whether the farm used the feed-through insecticides. So none means they did not use any. IGR means they used insect growth regulators, and OP means they used organophosphates. So you can see there were significantly fewer dung beetles and predatory beetles on farms that were using organophosphate feed-through insecticides. There were also significantly fewer horn flies on the farms that were using the feed-through insecticides. However, face flies, there was no significant differences. So those treatments didn't seem to be working for face flies, but they were negatively impacting those beneficial insect species. The results from 2024, when we did this, we only had farms that were either using no insecticides or that were using the insect growth regulator feed-through insecticides. So again, we have the beneficial insects on the top, the dung beetles here, and the predatory beetles there. And the abundances of those beneficial beetles were significantly lower on farms that were using the feed-through insecticides again. Those farms did also have significantly reduced pest fly numbers as well. I just want to briefly talk about grazing management. So the farms in this study were using different grazing strategies, so continuous grazing, rotational grazing, and management intensive rotational grazing. We did find that there were significantly fewer dung beetles and dung beetle species on farms using rotational grazing. That kind of made sense to us because in a continuous system, there's obviously more dung being deposited all the time. There's manure of different ages to support lots of different species in one pasture. However, we're not going to we're not suggesting that farmers would use continuous grazing, because there's obviously lots of other reasons not to. I just wanted to mention as well, a sort of continuation of this study. We were looking at the impacts of these insect growth regulators in a more controlled experiment. It's called a mesocosm study, which just means these buckets basically are the mesocosms. We put dung in the buckets on top of a load of sand, and some of the dung had the insecticide residues in it, and some of the dung did not. So we were comparing fly emergence and dung insect development between manure that had the insect growth regulators, the organophosphates, pyrethroids, and no treatments. We're still analysing these results, so I'm not really going to talk about any of those results, except one thing that really popped out to us, and that was the parasitoid wasp population. So you might have heard of these as fly predators. Farmers will release them. They are beneficial wasps. I showed you a picture of one earlier laying its egg in the pest fly puparium, and they will naturally suppress pest fly numbers in the pasture. So this figure is showing the number of parasitized fly pupae that had these parasitoid wasps in them, and then whether the farm used the insecticides along the bottom. So this is an insect growth regulator, this is an organophosphate, and sorry, this manure did not have any feed-through insecticides in it. And you can see that both of these feed-through insecticides completely knocked out the parasitoid wasp populations. So that's a very interesting result and is very counterproductive to supporting beneficial insect populations that would naturally be suppressing pest flies. So yeah, watch this space. We've got lots more results on that experiment coming out soon. I just wanted to show you, because this is pretty cool. These are the fly pupariums that we were finding in those mesocosms. On the right here, this is a normal one. So this is a face fly puparium, and you can see the adult fly in there, its butt sticking out and then the legs there. Whereas on the left here, you can see this one has been parasitized by the wasps. When we opened it up, it did not have a fly inside. It had all these little parasitoid wasps. So that's how we knew that there were differences between those treatment groups. All right, so the key messages from that work was that beetle abundance in the dung pats was significantly lower on farms using feed-through insecticides. Dung beetle species richness was also lower on those farms. And the parasitoid wasp populations are extremely sensitive to the insect growth regulator insecticides. So really using those feed-through insecticides all season long is not a sustainable control strategy. It would be better to monitor fly populations and only use treatments when it's necessary. Okay, so the final, I'll try and run through this quickly because I know we're reaching the end. The final thing I will talk about is the importance of dung beetle to pasture health. So this is a study we did in 2022. We worked with 29 grazing dairy farms in Vermont and New York State. Those farms were using different grazing strategies, and they were also using different pest and parasite management strategies. So some were using chemical pesticides, some were using alternative treatments like releasing those parasitoid wasps or essential oils, and others were using no treatments at all. So we measured soil health outcomes on these farms, pest and parasite populations, and also beneficial insect populations, including dung beetles. So I'm just going to focus on the dung beetle aspect of this. And this is the relationship between dung beetles and soil health on those farms. So these figures show dung beetle biodiversity up the side, and then soil health outcomes along the bottom. So we have soil organic matter, total nitrogen, and then bulk density, which is a indicator of soil compaction. So dung beetle biodiversity correlated with increased soil organic matter, increased soil nitrogen, and reduced compaction. And that kind of makes sense because, as I mentioned earlier, those tunneling dung beetles are bringing all those nutrients and organic matter from the dung down into the soil. And at the same time, those tunnels are reducing compaction. This is just highlighting the contribution of native dung beetle species. So this is the proportion of native dung beetle species, which correlated with increased soil carbon and increased soil nitrogen. So that's just showing the importance of the native species to soil health as well. And then finally, this is dung beetles as natural enemies. So relationships between dung beetles and pest and parasite populations on pastures. We have dung beetle abundance up the side, and then this first graph is showing pest fly abundance, and the second one is gastrointestinal worms of cattle. So you can see that dung beetle abundance correlated with reduced pest flies and also reduced gastrointestinal parasites. So again, as we've seen, the beetles are competing for dung resources with the pests and parasites, getting rid of that manure, reducing the breeding site, or those predatory species are directly predating them. So key messages from that is that dung beetle biodiversity is contributing to soil health outcomes on pastures. And although most dung beetles that we collected were introduced species from Europe, the proportion of native species on our pastures does contribute to soil health outcomes too. And dung beetle populations are helping to naturally suppress pests and parasites on pastures. And it's obviously important, therefore, to conserve especially our native dung beetle species and promote biodiversity on our farms. So my final slide is just some dung beetle friendly practices. Dung beetles need manure out there, so grazing animals firstly helps them, but grazing animals for as long as possible. So into the shoulder seasons, dung beetles are active quite early in the spring and surprisingly late into the fall. So even if it's not the whole herd, just getting 1 or 2 animals out there to provide the beetles with some food does help. Obviously, minimizing the use of pesticides, wormers and insecticides through using IPM, things like grazing management and alternative treatments. And then integrating woodland habitats. So we know that our native dung beetle species are generally more associated with the woodland habitat. They like sort of deer dung. So if we can integrate some woodland into our pastures, that can help to bolster the native dung beetle species populations as well. All right, that's the end. I don't know if you've got time for questions, but...
Yeah, thank you, Bryony. Plenty of time for questions. That was excellent. Very interesting work. Yeah, I have questions, but I'll take a back seat and let other folks unmute or type your question into the chat. Okay, we've got a question from Blake in the chat. I'll read it aloud. Does the type of dung impact the type of dung beetles you found? Which type of dung did you use for the surveys?
Yeah, so our studies so far have focused on cattle. So we've done dairy and beef. We're now, Ken and Hannah are now sort of leading some surveys on sheep. So we know that there are some differences between the dung beetle populations, between different types of dung. Many species are generalists, but there are some differences. So it will be interesting to look at sheep next. Yeah.
Great. And Maggie asks, which specific parasitoid wasps were active?
We did not identify the parasitoid wasps to species, so I can't tell you that, unfortunately.
Okay. And I was interested, in the mobility of the dung beetles. Um, you know, how you mentioned with rotational grazing, it might not be as conducive. I would imagine just spatial, the spatial barrier. Um, can they cross roads? How far can they go in a season? If you've got a field um, that's intensively grazed, and then one next door that's maybe a new field or rotating out of corn or soybeans or something with no kind of native resident population there. How long would it take for that to become kind of established or colonized with new dung beetles?
Yeah, so there's not really a great deal of research on sort of the dispersal ranges of dung beetles. They can travel several kilometers, so they can and they do disperse over the landscape. It's not super quick, but within a farm, you would expect them to be following the cattle around within a rotational system and to a new paddock. I think the local populations within a pasture can sort of build up quite locally because they would prefer not to travel long distances. But yeah, it's not super quick, but it definitely happens.
Ah, that's interesting. I wonder if they are following the cows themselves and the sounds or smells of the cows or the dung.
Yeah, I think it's mainly the volatiles from the dung that they're
Mm,
sort of tuned into. Yeah.
mhm. Okay, great. Other questions? Is Oh yeah, one from Blake. Um, do you process the dung in any way to ensure that it's homogeneous when using it for trapping, or is it similar attractiveness to beetles for trapping?
Yeah, that's a great question. It is important to sort of standardize dung when we're doing trapping techniques. However, when we're working with many farms, you obviously can't bring manure. You can't use the same manure and bring it to different farms for sort of biosafety. So what we generally do is, for example, the dung beetle extractors, we would take a core sample of an individual patty and put it into the extractors, but we would have a lot. So we would have about 20 different patties. And the idea there is that sort of differences in colonization, etc., between the various patties would sort of balance out and be captured by having a larger sample size of dung patties, essentially. But yeah, when you're doing sort of a controlled field trial, you would definitely need to homogenize the dung well to prevent differences in attraction and stuff.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah. I'm curious, you're in Scotland now. To what degree are your results from Vermont applicable in Scotland? And, if the species are different, are there similar species or kind of ecological niches filled there?
Yeah, so there are quite a lot of the same species. Probably because a lot of the species in Northeast America are those introduced species from Europe. So we do see a lot of crossover. But there are also differences, and I think there's some pretty cool beetles in America that we don't find over here. So
Okay. Any other questions? All right. Well, if not, I will stop the recording and folks can feel free to leave a nice thank you note in the chat.